The rain had just stopped when the old man stepped out of his shop and glanced up at the sky. Gray clouds hung low over the town, heavy like secrets. Water dripped slowly from the edge of the roof, landing in thick mud that had swallowed the dirt road whole. The town was quiet, too quiet for a place that claimed to be alive. In the distance, a church bell rang, dry, hollow, like someone knocking on a closed casket. He didn't like these kind of mornings. Inside his shop, the smell of pine and old varnish still clung to the walls. The floor creaked with age and memory. Wooden coffins lined the wall, some half-finished, some nailed shut. But not all of them had ever held the dead. The man people in town called him Graves. Though that wasn't his real name, moved slowly, but not without purpose. His hands were thick with calluses stained from years of work. He rarely spoke. Most didn't ask questions. He built boxes for the dead, and that was enough to make folks nervous. That suited him fine. But this morning something was off. He noticed it the second he stepped back in. A sound too light for rats, too careful to be wind. It came from the back room, from the supply closet that led to the storeroom, where he kept his tools and his hidden supplies. He walked softly, slow but deliberate, not bothering to grab anything for defense. Whatever was in there, it wasn't the first time he'd heard someone break in. The poor and desperate passed through often. He opened the door. There, huddled near a crate of wood shavings, was a girl, barefoot, filthy, her dress torn at the hem. Her hair was matted with sweat and dirt, cheeks, hollow eyes wide and glassy with fear. In her hands was a jar of pickled eggs, now half empty, and on the floor beside her was his last canteen of water. They stared at each other for a long moment, neither of them moving. She looked like she might bolt, like a rabbit cornered, wild and shivering. But her legs were trembling too badly to stand, and her lips were cracked from thirst. She'd made it this far, but not much further. Graves didn't speak. He simply walked to the shelf, grabbed another loaf of cornbread, wrapped in cloth, and handed it to her without a word. She hesitated, then took it with both hands as if it were made of gold. "You from the north?" he asked, voice low and gravelly. She nodded. He sat down on an overturned crate, watching her eat like she hadn't seen food in days. She didn't speak, not yet. He didn't press her. Her hands shook as she drank. She wiped her mouth with the back of her arm like a child. Eventually she whispered, "They took me from my father's farm. Said they'd send a ransom." "Did they?" he asked. "No one came. I ran when the wagon stopped. I didn't even know where I was going. Just not back." Graves nodded slowly. That was enough. He didn't need names. He didn't need explanations. He could read the story in her skin and her fingernails worn raw from running, in the way she flinched at his every movement. "You picked the right place to run into," he said. She looked at him, confused. He stood brushing sawdust from his lap. "Stay here tonight. Don't light any candles. Don't open the windows. And if you hear dogs, don't move." Her lips parted as if to ask why. But then she stopped. She just nodded, clutching the cornbread like a lifeline. Graves closed the door behind him. That night he worked later than usual. The shop filled with the sound of hammering, sawing, sanding. Not for the customers, not for the dead, but for the living, for someone who still had a chance. By dawn, a new coffin stood by the far wall, longer than most, lighter in weight, with tiny holes carved where no one would see. Not for a corpse, but for a girl who had stumbled into a coffin shop looking for water and might just walk out of it with her life. By the time the sun broke over the treetops, the girl was still asleep in the back room, curled under a wool blanket he'd pulled from the shelf. Graves stood outside the shop, smoking a pipe he hadn't touched in years. He watched the street like it might speak. Nothing did. He knew the pattern by now. When a runaway made it far enough south to cross paths with him, it meant the ones chasing her weren't far behind. The air always changed. Dogs barked less. Folks whispered more. Strangers lingered longer than they should. He finished the pipe, tucked the ashes into the dirt, and walked back inside. The girl stirred as he passed, blinking through sleep. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. He paused, hand on the edge of the doorframe. "I help anyone who runs from chains." She sat up slowly, rubbing her arm, still cautious, still not sure if this kindness came with a price. But Graves never asked her name. He didn't ask what farm she'd come from or how many nights she'd spent sleeping under trees. That silence was what made her start talking. She told him everything. About the men who came at dusk, faces wrapped in cloth, dragging her from the porch while her mother screamed and her father fought. About the long ride south, the rough talk, the threats. She spoke of the chance she took jumping from the wagon when they stopped to fix a broken wheel, running blindly through the forest, barefoot and bleeding. Graves listened without interrupting. He sat on a stool, sharpening a chisel, nodding occasionally. Not once did he flinch. Later that afternoon, while she slept again, he lifted the floorboards beneath the workbench and pulled out a folded canvas satchel. Inside were letters, maps, pieces of coded messages. He chose a blank parchment, dipped his pen, and began to write. It wasn't long, just enough to say, one passenger, young, white, taken, escaped, coming north. He sealed it in wax, pressed the edge of his knife against the mark, and slid it into his coat. He left without a word, locking the shop behind him. As he made his way toward the post drop, a hollowed tree 2 miles west, he didn't notice the man watching from the alley across the road. A tall, sharp-shouldered figure in a dusty Confederate coat, sipping from a flask, squinting in the sunlight like a snake warming its skin. Back at the shop, the girl woke up to silence. She tiptoed through the dim space, cautious but curious. Her fingers brushed along the edge of a finished coffin, perfectly polished. She hadn't noticed the one by the back wall before. It was longer, different. When she lifted the lid, she gasped. Inside, instead of satin lining, there was soft burlap cushions stuffed with hay and a small pouch of water strapped near the headrest. She stepped back, heart pounding. That's when she heard the creak of the back door. She turned too late. A man stood in the shadowed frame, not Graves. His eyes narrowed when he saw her. He stepped inside slow, like a man sure no one would stop him. Well, well, he muttered. What a pretty little mouse. She backed up instinctively. Who are you? He grinned. Let's just say, I've been sent to check the rat traps. His boots scraped across the wooden floor as he walked toward her. She grabbed a tool from the workbench, a dull wooden mallet, and held it up with trembling hands. He didn't stop. You scream, I gag you. You run, I make sure you can't run again. Her back hit the wall. She looked toward the door, toward the street, but no help would come fast enough. His hand reached out, rough, greedy, certain, and just then, from somewhere outside, she heard the faintest crunch of gravel. A door creaked open. She screamed anyway, loud, raw, not for help, just to fight the silence, and the door behind the man exploded open. He turned startled just in time to see Graves stepping into the light eyes, burning hands clenched around the handle of a carpenter's axe. He didn't speak. He didn't warn. And this time he didn't miss. The blow landed with a sickening thud that echoed through the wooden frame of the shop like thunder in a coffin. The man dropped where he stood, his body collapsing into a boneless heap, blood pooling quickly beneath his temple. Graves stood over him, breath-heavy but steady hands still gripping the axe handle, like he was holding back something even worse than violence. The girl slid down the wall, her legs no longer able to hold her. Her mouth hung open, stunned into silence, not by the gore, though there was plenty, but by the swiftness of it all. One moment she'd been prey, the next the room belonged to Graves, and death had chosen its side. He didn't say anything, didn't ask if she was all right. He simply lowered the axe, wiped the blade with a stained rag, and tossed it into the corner like it was just another tool to be cleaned later. He knelt beside the man's body and rolled it with practiced hands, checking for weapons documents, any sign that this death would echo louder than the blood trail it left behind. Then he looked at her. Get up, he said, voice low even. We don't have much time. She nodded, still shaking, and forced herself upright. Her knees buckled once, but she steadied against the workbench and followed him into the back room. Graves pulled out a canvas sack from beneath a floorboard and began tossing in supplies, jerky, a flask of water, a coil of rope, a small pouch of coins, a torn map of the backwoods and old logging routes. Everything he needed to disappear. Everything he'd prepared for again and again for moments like this. The girl hovered near the doorway, her voice thin. You killed him. Graves paused just long enough to look her in the eye. He was going to do worse, he said. She said nothing more after that. It took them less than 10 minutes to pack. Graves poured lamp oil around the shop, not to burn it himself, but so that if someone else tried, it would catch fast and hot. He dragged the body into the cellar, covered it with burlap, then with sawdust, then with old shipping crates. By the time they left through the rear door, The sky was already darkening to violet, and the scent of pine and danger hung in the air like a storm building in the bones. They rode double on his old mule, an animal far past its prime, but reliable patient. Graves sat behind reins in one hand, his other resting lightly near the small pistol strapped beneath his coat. The girl leaned forward, holding the pommel-tight eyes, flicking toward every tree, every rustle in the woods. They didn't speak. Somewhere behind them, not far enough, the silence of the street had been broken. The man Graves killed hadn't been alone. He'd been watching the shop for days. Graves had seen the boots by the alley, the eyes in the glass. There would be others, and they would not take long to smell blood. By the time the men came, 5 of them all armed and angry, the shop was dark. They didn't knock. They barged in like hammers through thin wood, shouting curses, pistols drawn. It took only moments to find the body. Then came the fury. They ransacked the place, kicking over shelves, splitting coffins open like cracked eggshells, overturning tables and spilling oil across the floors. Someone screamed, "He killed Jeb! The bastard's dead!" Another roared back, "He's not dead yet, but he will be." And when they couldn't find what they wanted, when the blood already spilled wasn't enough, they did what cowards do. They set the place ablaze. Flames licked the walls within seconds, fueled by the oil Graves had left behind. The fire roared like judgment, and the shop, his sanctuary, his work, his secret legacy, was swallowed by orange and black. The men stood outside, faces lit by the inferno, watching it burn like it was a funeral pyre, for control slipping through their hands. Then they released the hounds. The dogs howled into the forest noses, low teeth bared hungry for the scent of ash and flesh and freedom. The men followed on horseback, guns strapped across their backs, fury in their eyes. They didn't just want justice, they wanted revenge, and they would tear through the woods to get it. The forest didn't sleep that night. It moaned and shifted, alive with whispers of ash and smoke carried on the wind. Every gust smelled of fire and vengeance. Even the trees, still wet from spring rains, seemed to lean closer, their branches curling like fingers over the muddy trail. Somewhere in the distance, the hounds howled, not in triumph, not yet, but in promise. Graves urged the mule forward, though its breath came shallow and ragged. The beast had carried both him and the girl for miles, through thickets that tore at their clothes and up slopes that forced them to dismount more than once. Now it stumbled beneath them, legs trembling, but Graves didn't whip it. He simply whispered to it the way a man might whisper to an old friend, coaxing it forward, not with threat but with trust. The girl sat in front of him, arms wrapped tightly around the saddle horn. She hadn't spoken since they left. Every time she turned her head to look at him, he gave the same answer with his silence. "Not yet. We're not safe yet." They crested a ridge just as the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the trees. It wasn't much, just a graying of the sky beyond the black canopy, but enough to reveal the moss-covered stones that marked the edge of the northern slope. Below, the land rolled gently down toward a clearing where, somewhere out of sight, their destination waited. A safe house, a handoff point, a place where she could vanish into the folds of a network that had no name but many hands. Graves pulled the mule to a stop. He took out the battered brass spyglass from his coat and peered back over the ridge. Through the haze of ash and distant treetops, he could see them. Flickers of torchlight. Riders. They were moving faster now, no longer fanning out, no longer hunting. They were chasing, and they were closing in. The girl felt it too. She twisted in the saddle. "They're right behind us, aren't they?" Graves didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he dismounted. His knees buckled slightly as his boots hit the ground, pain flaring up his back and down through his hip. But he stood steadying himself with one hand on the saddle. Then he handed the reins to her. "Ride." She blinked, confused. "What, you heard me?" He adjusted the coat over his shoulders, making sure the revolver at his side was within easy reach. "Ride to the end of the path. You'll see 2 white stones. After that, there's a gate. Knock 3 times, then once more. They'll open." She shook her head violently. "No, I'm not leaving you." "You don't have time to argue," he said, voice like split oak, rough but unyielding. "They're too close. That mule can't carry 2 of us anymore, not fast enough. And I've bought too many people their time to waste yours." Tears welled in her eyes. "You'll die, then I'll die standing up." She clutched the reins tighter, jaw-clenched, lips trembling. For a second, she didn't move. Then with a choked breath, she leaned forward, forehead pressed briefly to his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Graves said nothing, just placed a weathered hand over hers, squeezed once, and stepped back. She spurred the mule. It hesitated for half a second, then lunged forward, hooves striking mud and roots and stone. The girl bent low over its back. Within seconds, she was gone, swallowed by trees, vanishing like a ghost toward safety. Graves turned. He walked back up to the top of the ridge, took position behind a boulder, and knelt into the damp earth. His breath was calm, his heart steady. The hounds were louder now, and so were the men, shouting commands, swearing into the wind-cracking whips as they pushed their mounts harder. He pulled the revolver free and checked the cylinder. There was still enough. Enough for now. Then he leaned back against the stone, watching the path below, and whispered into the wind, as if to no one in particular. "Just a little longer, girl. Just make it there." And then he waited. The trees blurred as the mule galloped forward, each thud of its hooves pounding like a desperate drumbeat in the girl's chest. Wind clawed at her face, tore through her hair, and stung her eyes, but she didn't blink. She couldn't. Every breath she took felt stolen, borrowed from the time Graves was buying her with his life. She followed the path he'd described, roots and stones underfoot, branches slapping against her arms like frantic warnings. Her knuckles whitened on the reins. She was close. She had to be. Then at the crest of a bend, she saw them two white stones, half buried in moss, flanking a crooked wooden gate. She jumped down before the mule stopped moving, stumbled once, then ran to the gate, heart thudding like it might rip through her ribs. 3 knocks. A pause. 1 more. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the sound of the forest breathing behind her. Then the door creaked. A man appeared, tall, armed, grim. He didn't speak. He just saw her face and stepped aside. "They're coming!" she gasped, pointing back. He stayed behind to fight them off. "Please, you have to help him." The man turned and shouted something over his shoulder. More figures emerged, half a dozen, all sharp-eyed, all already moving before her words had finished hanging in the air. They moved with a silent urgency, like people who'd done this before. No questions, no hesitation, just action. Back on the ridge, Graves remained motionless, behind the boulder, listening. The forest no longer whispered, it roared. The crack of twigs, the baying of dogs, the heavy thud of hooves growing louder. He could hear the men now laughing, shouting threats. Close. He gripped his revolver tight. The first rider burst through the trees. Graves didn't wait. 1 shot clean. The man fell backward off his horse, with a grunt body thudding against the dirt. The others reeled for a moment, startled. That pause was all Graves needed. He shifted his aim. Another shot, 1 more body dropped. Then the shouting began. "There he is! Shoot him dead!" Graves ducked low as bullets tore through the leaves above him. He fired again, missed, fired again. Another man screamed, but then click. The revolver clicked again. Empty. Graves exhaled, slow and steady. He dropped the gun beside him, not with fear, but with finality. He tried to stand to move back behind another stone, but pain flared sharp and searing through his thigh. He looked down, blood dark and spreading. A second burn scorched his shoulder. They'd hit him. He slumped down against the stone, breathing shallow. Hands trembling now, not from fear, but from loss of blood of time. And yet a smile ghosted across his lips. Because she was safe. He had felt it, something in the wind and the shift of the earth beneath him. She'd made it. The mule hadn't come back. No screams had followed. No fresh scent of her panic on the breeze. That meant she was gone. Gone and safe. He leaned his head back against the stone, eyes half-lidded, the firelight of memory flickering behind them. He pictured her face not as it was when she arrived, frightened and filthy, but bright-eyed, angry, determined. He saw her riding away from him, her figure fading into the dawn, like the last chapter of a book he'd read 1,000 times and finally understood. The voices came closer. He didn't flinch. A final breath passed his lips, slow, soft, like the closing of a door. Then a sudden crack of gunfire, sharp, unexpected. A rider screamed. Another fell. Then another. Graves' eyes fluttered open. Shapes moved through the trees, fast, precise. Gunshots rang out from all directions, not wild and angry, like the men chasing him, but controlled. Tactical, familiar. Then came the yelling, not his enemies this time, but the unmistakable commands of men trained to rescue, not conquer. One of the raiders turned and ran. Another fell forward off his horse, the back of his coat dark with blood. The rest, what few remained, scattered like dry leaves before the wind. A hand gripped Graves' shoulder, steady but firm. "Stay with me, old man," a voice said. "You've done your part. Let us take it from here." And just before everything went black, Graves whispered one word, not a plea, not a prayer, but a promise to himself. Good. When he opened his eyes again, the world was softer, quieter. No more bullets, no more hounds, no more burning timber or shouting men. Just a pale ceiling, the creak of wooden beams overhead, and the faint scent of clean linens and salve. Graves blinked slowly. His body felt heavy as though someone had replaced his blood with river stones. He tried to move, but a warm hand stopped him gently. "Don't," a voice whispered. "You're safe." He turned his head just enough to see her. She was seated at his bedside, eyes-rimmed red hair, pulled back messily like she hadn't slept in days. And when she looked at him, really looked, her face cracked with relief. "You're awake," she breathed, and then without waiting, leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, careful not to touch the wound still bandaged beneath the blanket. "I knew you'd live. I knew it." He wanted to speak, but all that came out was a soft grunt, half a smile. Later, when the pain dulled and his mind cleared, they let her explain everything. How she'd reached the safe house. How the team had charged back into the forest with her leading the way. How they'd found him bloodied but alive, clutching the empty revolver like a symbol carved from sheer will. And how they'd brought him here across the border to a quiet farmhouse nestled among gentle hills in northern Pennsylvania. She never left his side. The first day he stood again using a cane, in the frame of a doorway for balance, she was there, arms outstretched, like a child waiting to catch a father. And for the first time, he didn't resist the idea. They gave him a room, fresh clothes, and a name that meant something again. But what touched him most wasn't the comfort or the warmth, it was the way her family looked at him. Her father, a stoic man with graying hair and deep-set eyes, shook Graves' hand, like greeting an old war hero. Her mother wept softly into a kerchief, clutching his hand and calling him a miracle in boots. And then there was the moment she said it out loud in front of everyone. "This is my godfather," she declared, without a stammer or doubt. "He saved my life, and he belongs here now with us." Graves had never belonged anywhere before. Not really. Not since the war. Not since the plantations. Not since the first nail he'd hammered into a coffin meant to carry someone who deserved better. But here in this quiet place, surrounded by people who looked at him not with fear or pity, but with respect, he felt something crack inside him. Something old and lonely began to let go. He stayed with them through the spring, healing slowly. Each day he sat on the porch with a blanket over his knees, sipping tea, while she read aloud from books her mother had collected over the years. Some days she'd bring him letters from others, messages of thanks from freed families he'd helped, stories passed along the underground like sacred hymns. Others wrote to ask for guidance, advice, even courage. But even in that peace, he wasn't still. Late at night, when the house fell into silence, he'd sit by the window and stare out into the fields, thinking of those who hadn't made it. The men and women still chained by invisible hands, still buried in fear. The children hiding under floorboards. The mothers digging tunnels with their bare hands. The fathers pretending to be dumb beasts just to protect their sons from being sold off. Freedom had come to him, but it hadn't come to everyone. He knew that, and so did she. One evening, as the sky blushed purple and the air smelled faintly of lilacs, she came to sit beside him. "I see it in your eyes," she said softly. "You think you're done, but you're not." He chuckled weakly. "I'm old, girl. You're needed. I gave everything I had out there." She turned to him, took his hand in both of hers. "Then give them your name now, your story. Let them know what it means to keep going, even when the world tells you to lie down and die." He looked at her for a long moment. "You really think I still matter?" "I think," she said, eyes shining with certainty, "that as long as there's one soul left to save, you do." Graves didn't answer right away. But later that night, he asked for his boots. Graves didn't write out that night. He wasn't foolish enough to think the years had left him untouched. But he wrote a letter, then another, then 10 more. Each carried the same message, not of war or fire or vengeance, but of resolve, of the silent bridges hidden under the moonlight, of the carved wooden caskets that held not bodies but breath and dreams, of the nights when freedom came in the shape of an old man's trembling hands and the creak of wheels rolling northward. The letters spread, first through the safe houses, then to couriers, abolitionist papers, and whispered networks. They called him the coffin maker, though most never knew his face. But the name came to mean something ironclad, something unyielding, a symbol that even the gravest of purposes could be carried by the gentlest of men. He joined the network again, not with nails and wood this time, but with knowledge, strategy, names, roots. He trained others. He told them how to breathe inside the coffin, how to time the journey with patrol shifts, how to identify friendly farms by the slant of their barns or the color of a single shutter left ajar. And through it all, the girl Anna never left his side. She became his second voice, the one who could step into places he could not speak, where he would be silenced. She called him Papa Graves, and in time even the children in the nearby villages said it too. At first it embarrassed him, made his ears redden and his voice go quiet. But he never corrected them. She made good on her promise, treated him like family. And not just her mother baked for him. Her father read the news aloud each morning. On Sundays, the town's preacher made space for a chair, right beside his own in the pew. People waved when he passed. The children called out to him with glee. For the first time in a long while, Graves didn't just survive, he belonged. But his eyes never fully softened. Not entirely. He still walked with that old cane, still paused sometimes to stare down the road longer than needed, still listened too closely when the wind shifted. He knew in some part of his bones that rest was not his natural state. He had become a bridge, not a destination, and bridges weren't built to sit still. So when the time came, when a fresh call for help arrived from a town 2 counties away, where a woman and her 3 children were being hunted for escape, Graves didn't hesitate. "I'll go," he said simply. Anna looked up sharply from the dinner table. "You're still healing. I've been healing too long. But there are younger men now. Stronger," he smiled. "Maybe so. But they don't know what I know." She rose, walked around the table, and placed her hand on his shoulder. "At least promise me you'll be careful. I'll promise to do right." And he did. That final mission was quiet, clean. He got them out with the help of 2 former slaves turned conductors. The woman wrote him a letter months later from Canada, said her son still remembered the man who carried her youngest on his back across a frozen creek. That winter was hard on Graves. His lungs rasped at night, his joints refused to bend. But he kept going, kept teaching, kept writing, until one morning he simply didn't wake. They found him seated in his chair by the window blanket, over his knees, pen still in hand. On the desk in front of him was a letter half finished. It began, "To whomever finds this and still believes that freedom is worth the cost." The town buried him beneath an old oak on the edge of Anna's family land. The stone read, "Isaiah Graves, a builder of boxes, a breaker of chains." But it wasn't the headstone that people came to see. It was the statue. They built it a year later in the town square. Carved from smooth black granite, it showed Graves standing tall, coat blowing in the wind, one hand resting on a wooden coffin with the lid slightly ajar. Inside, instead of death, was light carved so skillfully that sunlight caught in the cracks and spilled like hope. Children touched it every day. Some placed wildflowers at its base, and Anna, grown and steady, would return each year, on the day he passed, sit by the statue with her hand resting on the stone and whisper, "You were never just a coffin maker. You were the key." Thank you for watching this story to the end. If it touched you, please consider liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who still believes in hope, freedom, and quiet acts of courage. Your support helps us keep these voices alive, one story at a time.